Friday, 8th of April, 2005, 7 in the morning. The workers of the early shift arrive at Longbridge as they always have. Flasks of tea, cigarettes barely lit, the familiar low thunder of the assembly line drifting through the gates. 9 hours later, those gates will close for the last time. 40 years earlier, this single factory in South Birmingham produced one Mini every 2 minutes. A car that redefined what Britain could make, what Britain could mean. At its peak, 27,000 people clocked in here daily. The noise was relentless, the ambition vast, the pride for those who lived it, something close to identity. By the morning of 8th of April 2005, 6,500 of them would have no job to return to. The line fell silent. The locks were changed. What killed Longbridge? Bad management, militant unions, political interference, foreign indifference. Every verdict has its advocate, and none of them is entirely wrong. The answer begins, as it always does, not with the collapse, but with the man who started it all. In the spring of 1901, a small factory on the southern edge of Birmingham fell silent. The White and Pike Printing Company had spent 6 years attempting to manufacture tin boxes on a patch of semi-rural land beside the Bristol Road, a venture that had never quite found its footing and had finally run out of money altogether. The machines were stripped, the doors were locked, and for 4 years, the building sat empty, accumulating damp and debt, listed in the books of a Birmingham financier named E.A. Olivieri at an asking price of £11,000. Nobody came. The land itself was unremarkable. Flat, slightly boggy, hemmed in by the railway line of the Midlands Hailsowen branch to the west and open fields to the south. Longbridge, as the district was known, was barely a village. A handful of houses, a public house, a station stop that most trains passed through without slowing. There was nothing here to suggest that this particular patch of Worcestershire border country would, within half a century, become the beating industrial heart of the British motor industry. Herbert Austin saw something different. In the summer of 1905, Austin was 48 years old and at a crossroads that most men of his generation would have found alarming. He had spent the previous decade building his reputation as general manager of the Wolseley Sheep Shearing and Machine Company in Aston, a role in which he had quietly, methodically transformed a modest engineering concern into one of Britain's earliest serious manufacturers of motor cars. He was good at it. He was, by all accounts, brilliant at it. And in early 1905, he resigned. The reasons were not sentimental. Austin had come to believe that Wolseley's board lacked the courage for what the motor industry was about to demand. Scale, speed, mechanization, the willingness to commit fully and irrevocably to the machine age. He wanted to build his own company on his own terms, with his own name above the door. On the 26th of June 1905, the Austin Motor Company Limited was formally registered. Its founder had a name, a plan, and very little else. What he needed, with some urgency, was a factory. The Longbridge site came to his attention through the kind of practical Birmingham networking that built the city's industrial base. A conversation, a recommendation, a visit. Austin walked the empty floor of the old printing works, noted the railway access, the road frontage, the surrounding land available for future expansion. He made his offer, £7,500, substantially below Olivieri's asking price. The offer was accepted. Austin had bought himself a ruin. What happened next has the quality of myth, though it is, in every verifiable detail, true. With the annual motor show approaching, and nothing yet to show the press or the public, Austin drove his workforce at a pace that would become characteristic of his entire management style. Within 2 weeks of taking possession of the Longbridge site, the Austin Motor Company had assembled its first vehicle, a 25-horsepower car built largely by hand from components already in preparation. It was displayed at the 1905 Motor Show, firm orders were placed, and Longbridge's century of car manufacture had begun. By 1906, the factory was producing 4 cars each week. It was, by the standards of a nascent industry, a modest output. Ford's plant at Trafford Park was already operating on a different scale entirely. But Austin was not yet thinking in terms of volume. He was thinking in terms of foundations. What distinguished Austin from many of his contemporaries was not entrepreneurial flair, though he possessed that in sufficient quantity. It was engineering conviction. Austin was, above all else, a practical man, a man who understood machines from the inside out, who believed that the answer to almost every manufacturing problem was more precision, more mechanization, better systems. His early visits to American factories, where he had observed the emerging logic of mass production, left a permanent impression. He returned to Longbridge determined to build not merely a workshop, but a system. Expansion came quickly. By the end of the decade, new workshops had been added, the workforce had grown substantially, and the site was already beginning its long, complicated negotiation with the land around it, pushing outward in every direction that geography and finance permitted. A railway station was built within the works boundary in 1915, the Midland Railway extending a spur line to serve what was by then one of Birmingham's most significant employers. Austin himself remained a daily presence, on the floor, in the drawing offices, making decisions with the directness of a man who had designed engines with his own hands and saw no reason why management should be any different. Those who worked under him in the early years describe a quality that is difficult to pin down precisely, an absolute certainty, a refusal to accept that what had not yet been done could not be done. It was a quality that would build an empire. It was also, in the long run, a quality that the empire would eventually find it could not sustain. By the 1930s, Austin had made himself one of the most significant industrialists in British history. The company bore his name, occupied hundreds of acres, and employed thousands. He had been knighted Sir Herbert Austin in recognition of the factory's extraordinary contribution to the First World War effort. And yet quietly, methodically, in the way that large companies tend to absorb the men who founded them, Austin was losing his grip. He died in May 1941 in his 75th year at his home in Lickey Hills, a short distance from the factory he could see from the upper windows on a clear day. The Austin Motor Company continued without him, as large institutions always do. The name remained above the gate, but the man who had bought a ruin for £7,500 and turned it into the foundations of British automotive history was gone. What came next would test those foundations in ways he could not have imagined. In the summer of 1914, Longbridge employed roughly 2,000 people. By the autumn of 1918, it had helped arm a nation. The transition was neither gradual nor gentle. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, the government moved quickly to requisition industrial capacity on a scale that had no precedent in British manufacturing history. Longbridge, with its railway access, its floor space, and its already established culture of precision engineering, was an obvious candidate. Within months, the factory that had been building private motor cars for the Midlands gentry was producing shells, guns, and aero engines for the Western Front. The numbers accumulated with the grinding logic of industrial warfare. Over the course of the First World War, Longbridge produced more than 8 million shell cases, a figure so large it resists easy comprehension, best understood perhaps as one shell for every yard of the Western Front, repeated many times over. Alongside them, 650 artillery guns, 2,000 aircraft, 2,500 aero engines, 2,000 military trucks. The factory did not pause to consider the scale of what it was making. It simply made it. To accommodate this transformation, the government funded a substantial expansion of the site. Work began on the new West Works in December 1916, completed by June 1917. A vast machine shop 660 feet long, 330 feet wide, housing 1,000 individual machines, each driven by its own electric motor. It was the most sophisticated manufacturing facility in the Midlands at the time of its construction, and it had been built almost entirely at public expense. The logic was clear even then. When national survival is at stake, the distinction between private enterprise and public investment becomes difficult to maintain. Herbert Austin was knighted in 1917. The honor was deserved. Longbridge had exceeded every production target the government had set for it, but the war left something else behind. Something less easy to quantify than shell cases or aircraft engines. It left the habit of scale, the expanded factory, the enlarged workforce, the infrastructure of a site that now sprawled across both sides of the Bristol Road, all of this persisted into peacetime, and with it came both opportunity and obligation. Longbridge could now produce at a volume that would have been unimaginable in 1905. The question was what to produce, and for whom. Austin's answer arrived in 1922, and it changed everything. The Austin 7 was, in conception, almost perversely simple. A four-cylinder engine of just 747 cubic centimeters. Four seats of a kind. A top speed that a determined cyclist might approach on a downhill gradient. It was, by any sporting measure, inadequate. It was also, by any social measure, a revolution. Before the Austin 7, the motor car in Britain was a possession of the prosperous. Running costs, purchase price, and the sheer mechanical complexity of existing vehicles confined car ownership to those who could afford both the machine and a man to maintain it. The Austin 7 changed that calculation entirely. At a launch price of £165, roughly half the cost of any comparable vehicle on the market, it put four wheels and an engine within reach of the British middle class for the first time. The press called it the Baby Austin. The public called it simply the 7. Within 3 years of its introduction, it had effectively eliminated the market for cycle cars and light motorcycles in Britain, vehicles that had previously served those who could not afford a full motor car. Stanley Baldwin owned one. The young John Cooper raced one. Manufacturers in Germany and Japan licensed the design and built their own derivatives. What Herbert Austin had created in his Longbridge drawing office was not merely a successful product. It was the British equivalent of the Ford Model T, a machine that democratized mobility. Production expanded. The workforce grew. The site continued its restless outward march, absorbing neighboring land, adding buildings, threading internal roads and railway sidings through what had once been open fields. By the mid-1930s, Longbridge was the largest car factory in Britain and one of the largest in Europe. The man who had bought a derelict print works for £7,500 had built something that no longer fitted comfortably inside any single person's comprehension. And then, for the second time in a generation, the world went to war. The preparations at Longbridge in 1939 were more deliberate than those of 1914. The government had learned from the previous conflict that industrial conversion took time, and time in a modern war was the one commodity that could not be manufactured. Shadow factories, dispersed facilities designed to be quickly converted to war production, had been planned in advance. At Longbridge, the most significant of these was a facility built underground. The Arrow, as it was known, was constructed beneath and adjacent to the main factory site. A shadow works designed to be invisible from the air, insulated against the bombing that the government correctly anticipated would target Britain's manufacturing centers. Within this underground facility, and in the associated East Works at nearby Cofton Hackett, Longbridge produced more than 3,000 aircraft during the course of the Second World War. Among them, Hawker Hurricanes, the fighters that bore the heaviest burden of the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, and Avro Lancasters, the heavy bombers that carried the war back to Germany through 4 long years of night raids. Above ground, the factory produced with equal intensity ammunition, heavy artillery shells, steel helmets, lifeboat engines, military trucks. The workers, many of them women, filling the roles left empty by men who had gone to serve, kept the lines running through air raid warnings, through the winters of 1940 and 1941, through the particular exhaustion of people who understood that what they were making and how quickly they made it was not an abstraction. By 1945, Longbridge had survived 2 world wars, a global depression, and the loss of its founder. Its workforce numbered in the tens of thousands. Its site covered hundreds of acres. Its capacity was unmatched anywhere in Britain. It had never been more powerful. It had never been more complicated to run. And the decisions that would determine whether all of it had a future were about to begin. On the 26th of August 1959, the British Motor Corporation unveiled a car that nobody had asked for and almost everybody within a very short time would want. It had no name yet, only a designation, the ADO 15, an internal code that told the public nothing and the engineers everything. It was small to the point of impertinence. 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, a cabin that appeared from the outside to have been compressed by some external force. The press, invited to inspect it at a series of carefully staged previews, responded with the particular caution of people who have been surprised before. Interesting, they wrote. Unusual. One correspondent noted, with the restraint characteristic of the British motoring press, that it was not immediately obvious what market the vehicle was intended to serve. Within 6 months, the waiting lists were running to several weeks. The man responsible for the car's conception was Alec Isigonis, a British engineer of Greek Cypriot descent, already known for the Morris Minor. A man whose approach to design was defined by a deliberate hostility to received wisdom. When the Suez Crisis of 1956 sent petrol prices climbing and small continental cars flooding into British showrooms, BMC's chairman Leonard Lord gave Isigonis a single instruction: build something smaller, cheaper, and more practical than anything currently on the British market. Isigonis took the instruction literally. The solution he arrived at was radical in its simplicity. By mounting the engine transversely, sideways across the engine bay, rather than in the conventional longitudinal position, Isigonis freed up 80% of the car's floor space for passengers and luggage. The gearbox was positioned beneath the engine, sharing its oil. The wheels were pushed to the extreme corners of the body. The result was a vehicle the size of a city flat that somehow contained, with reasonable comfort, 4 adults and their weekend luggage. What Longbridge had been given was not merely a new model, it was a new idea about what a car could be. The original launch price was £496 for the standard saloon. Modest by the standards of the day, accessible to a market that had previously been beyond BMC's reach. And yet embedded in that price was a problem that the accountants understood and the salesman preferred not to dwell upon. The Mini cost more to build than it cost to buy. Every car that rolled out of Longbridge carried with it, invisibly but insistently, a small financial loss. The more Minis BMC sold, the more money BMC lost. It was, as commercial paradoxes go, a spectacular one. A car so well engineered that its own success was a form of slow hemorrhage. Nobody stopped making it. The reason was not corporate negligence, though negligence played its part in later years. The reason was that the Mini had become something that no balance sheet could fully account for, a cultural object. By the mid-1960s, it was everywhere, in the hands of film stars and factory workers alike, driven by racing drivers on circuits across Europe, immortalized in a bank robbery film that turned a car chase through the streets of Turin into one of the most celebrated sequences in British cinema. The Beatles owned Minis. Twiggy was photographed beside one. Peter Sellers had his upholstered in wickerwork by a coach builder in Hertfordshire. At its production peak, a finished Mini left the Longbridge assembly line every 2 minutes. The rhythm of it, the compressed, insistent 2-minute cycle, became the pulse of the factory itself, the measure by which everything else was calibrated. 27,000 people were employed on the site by the late 1960s, many of them engaged, directly or indirectly, in the production of a car that had redrawn the boundaries of what British manufacturing could achieve. The Mini won the Monte Carlo Rally outright in 1964, 1965, and 1967, then was disqualified from the 1966 result on a technicality that the French organizers applied to the British cars alone and not to the French ones. The disqualification was, in the eyes of many, a form of tribute. You only cheat against a competitor you cannot otherwise beat. Back in Longbridge, the line ran on. But beneath the noise and the pride and the international recognition, the structural weakness was deepening. The pricing problem had never been resolved. It had simply been absorbed year after year into a financial model that grew increasingly dependent on volume to mask the absence of margin. Management knew. The unions knew, in a general way. The government, which was beginning to take an uncomfortable interest in British Leyland's finances, knew too. What none of them had yet reckoned with was the full implication of what they knew. That a factory capable of producing the most famous small car in the world had been doing so, for most of a decade, at a loss it could not sustain. The Mini did not kill Longbridge. Nothing so simple as that. But it established, in those gleaming, chaotic, celebrated years of the 1960s, a pattern of making decisions on the basis of what felt right rather than what added up. A pattern that would prove, in the end, very difficult to break. The line kept moving. Every 2 minutes, another car. And somewhere in the ledgers, quietly, the numbers kept not balancing. One morning in the autumn of 1968, the workers arriving for their early shift at Longbridge found that the sign above the main gate had been changed overnight. The Austin name, the name that Herbert Austin had placed above his factory 63 years earlier, the name that had meant something specific and legible to every person who lived within 10 miles of the Bristol Road, was gone. In its place, British Leyland Motor Corporation. 6 words that told the workers precisely nothing about what they were making, who owned it, or why the change had happened without announcement, without ceremony, without so much as a notice on the board inside the gatehouse. Nobody came to explain. The line started as usual. The gates opened and the shift began, as it always did. But something had shifted that morning that had nothing to do with the machinery. It had been building for 16 years. In 1952, the Austin Motor Company merged with its long-standing rival, the Nuffield Organization, makers of Morris, MG, Riley, and Wolseley, to form the British Motor Corporation. On paper, BMC was a formidable entity, the largest car manufacturer in Britain, the 4th largest in the world, a combine capable of producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually and competing, at least in theory, with whatever Ford and General Motors chose to put in front of it. In practice, BMC was 2 companies in a single building pretending to agree. The cultures of Austin and Morris had been shaped by different founders, different geographies, different ideas about how a car company should be run. Austin's men, rooted in Birmingham, in engineering precision, in the tradition Herbert Austin had established, regarded the Oxford-based Morris operation with a suspicion that decades of rivalry had calcified into something close to contempt. The feeling was mutual and freely expressed in the canteens and the drawing offices and the corridors where the decisions that shaped both companies were made. The merger had been arranged at the level of boardrooms and government departments. Nobody had thought to arrange it at the level of the people who actually built the cars. The consequences were visible almost immediately in the product range. BMC's great commercial sin, badge engineering, was not invented in 1952, but it was systematized there. The same mechanical platform, the same body shell, the same engine appeared simultaneously under 4 or 5 different nameplates, sold through different dealer networks, marketed to subtly different demographics, as though the customers might not notice that the Riley 1.5 and the Wolseley 1500 and the MG Magnet were beneath their differing radiator grills and leather trim levels, substantially the same car. Sometimes they did notice. Often they did not care. Always the practice eroded the meaning of every mark it touched. Austin, Morris, Riley, Wolseley, each one a name with its own history, its own loyalties, slowly hollowed out by the logic of shared components. By the mid-1960s, BMC was producing more models than any comparable manufacturer in the world, and making less profit per vehicle than almost any of them. The Mini's pricing problem was not an isolated anomaly. It was the symptom of a company that had never resolved the fundamental tension between its 2 founding cultures, and had chosen, year after year, to manage that tension through complexity rather than clarity. Harold Wilson's government looked at this situation in 1967 and arrived at the conclusion that would define British industrial policy for the following decade. The problem was insufficient scale. What the British motor industry needed, in the government's analysis, was not fewer models or cleaner finances or a resolution of the cultural fault lines running through every factory it operated. It needed to be bigger. In 1968, Wilson's Industrial Reorganization Corporation engineered the merger of British Motor Holdings, the successor to BMC, with Leyland Motors, a profitable truck and bus manufacturer that had recently absorbed both Triumph and Rover. The result was British Leyland Motor Corporation, a company employing, at its formation, roughly 170,000 people, operating 48 manufacturing plants across Britain, and carrying within its structure every unresolved problem that its constituent parts had accumulated over the previous 2 decades. At Longbridge, the sign above the gate was changed and the line ran on. For a time, the new company maintained the appearance of coherence. There were reorganization plans, investment programs, optimistic statements from the executive suites in Leyland's London headquarters. There were genuine successes. The Rover P6, voted European Car of the Year in 1964 and still in production, represented what the group could achieve when engineering talent was properly deployed. But the structural contradictions were too deep and too numerous to be managed by any reorganization plan that stopped short of the fundamental surgery the company required. The problems compounded. Development budgets were spread too thinly across too many competing platforms. Factories that should have been consolidated were kept open for political reasons. Each closure a potential industrial dispute, each dispute a potential electoral liability. The internal competition between plants that should have been cooperating. Longbridge against Cowley, Austin against Morris, Birmingham against Oxford, persisted long after the merger that was supposed to end it. And running beneath all of it, with increasing urgency, was the question of money. By 1974, British Leyland was losing it faster than it could be replaced. The company's request for emergency government funding landed on the desk of Harold Wilson's newly re-elected Labour government in early 1975. The Ryder Report, commissioned to assess British Leyland's position, delivered its verdict that spring with the clarity of a diagnosis nobody wanted to hear. The company was functionally bankrupt. Without immediate and substantial government intervention, it would cease to exist within months. The government intervened. British Leyland was effectively nationalized, the state acquiring an 80% shareholding, injecting public money on a scale that would, by the end of the decade, reach into the billions. Longbridge, the largest plant in the group and the most politically visible, was now a ward of the British state, an institution too large to fail, too troubled to fix, and too important to too many people in too many constituencies to be allowed to simply run its course. The sign above the gate still said, British Leyland. Inside, 27,000 people were about to discover what it meant to work for a company that belonged, in some complicated and unresolvable sense, to everyone, and therefore, in the way that such things tend to work, to no one. Derek Robinson started at Longbridge as an apprentice in the 1940s. He was a Birmingham boy, the son of a working man, trained in the factory's own engineering school at a time when an Austin apprenticeship was considered one of the more reliable routes out of the particular kind of poverty that the industrial Midlands both generated and sustained. He learned his trade on the floor. He learned the culture of the place, its hierarchies, its loyalties, its unwritten codes, from the men who worked beside him. By the time he rose to become the senior shop steward and then the convener of the Transport and General Workers Union at Longbridge in the early 1970s, Robinson had spent the better part of 3 decades inside the factory. He knew it in the way that men who have given their working lives to a single institution know it, not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality, a daily presence, a place with its own logic and its own grievances. The grievances, by the early 1970s, were considerable. The Longbridge assembly line in this period was not the sleek, roboticized facility that British Leyland's press releases occasionally implied. It was in large parts aging infrastructure, running at intensities it had not been designed to sustain, managed through a supervisory structure that the best manufacturing consultants of the era would have identified, on a brief acquaintance, as chronically dysfunctional. The piecework payment system, by which workers were paid according to output rather than hours, had evolved over decades into something of such labyrinthine complexity that disputes about rates and calculations were, quite literally, inevitable. There were, at any given time, hundreds of separate pay agreements operating simultaneously across the Longbridge site, negotiated at shop floor level by individual stewards, frequently contradicting one another, and collectively impossible for any central management to either understand or control. Into this environment in 1972 came a new management philosophy under British Leyland's chief executive Donald Stokes, and later under the restructuring plans of the mid-decade. The intention to rationalize, to standardize, to strip out the accumulated complexity and replace it with systems that could actually be managed. The intention was correct. The execution, abrupt, poorly communicated, and experienced by the workforce as an assault on arrangements they had spent years negotiating, was not. The strikes at Longbridge in the 1970s were the result. Between 1978 and 1979, British Leyland formally attributed 523 separate disputes at the Longbridge plant to Derek Robinson's influence. The figure was cited in government reports, repeated in newspaper editorials, and eventually fixed in the public imagination as the measure of the man. Red Robbo, the name had been given to him by the press, with the implication clear in every syllable, was in this telling a Soviet sympathizing wrecker, a man ideologically committed to the destruction of British industry from within. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more human. Robinson was a Communist Party member, a fact he had never concealed and that the press had never allowed the public to forget. But the 523 disputes attributed to him were not, in any meaningful sense, 523 decisions made by Derek Robinson. The majority were brief stoppages, an afternoon here, a morning there, initiated by individual shop stewards responding to local grievances on their own sections of the line. Robinson, as convener, was the most senior union figure on the site, and therefore the figure to whom management attributed responsibility for whatever the workforce collectively did. It was, in the logic of industrial relations, a convenient simplification. It was not an accurate description of how the stoppages actually began or how they were sustained. What Robinson understood, and what his critics, inside and outside the factory, consistently refused to credit, was that the men stopping work were stopping work for reasons. The reasons were not always proportionate. They were not always rational. They were not always, by any objective measure, justified. But they were reasons, rooted in real conditions, real frustrations, real experiences of a management culture that had, over many years, accumulated a deficit of trust so large that almost any provocation could trigger a response. He was not wrong about that. He was, however, making the analysis of a man whose every interest lay in the continuation of the existing order. A man who needed the factory and the union and the conflict to persist in their current form because his own significance depended upon it. This is not a condemnation. It is simply the structural position of any institution's most powerful representative. In October 1979, British Leyland's new chairman, Michael Edwards, a South African-born executive brought in by the government to impose the discipline that all previous management had failed to deliver, dismissed Derek Robinson. The immediate cause was a pamphlet Robinson had co-authored criticizing Leyland's recovery plan. The underlying cause was that Edwards had concluded correctly that a fundamental transformation of working practices at Longbridge was impossible while Robinson remained the dominant force on the shop floor. The dismissal was put to the Longbridge workforce for a vote. The result was the one that Robinson's enemies had always claimed was impossible. The workers voted, by a substantial majority, not to strike in his defense. It was, for a man who had spent 30 years as their representative, a verdict of peculiar cruelty. Not because the workers had turned against him. Exactly. The mood was more complicated than that, threaded through with exhaustion and a pragmatic recognition that the factory's survival required accommodations that the old order could not make. But Robinson had built his authority on the premise that he spoke for the people behind the line. In October 1979, the people behind the line spoke for themselves. He left Longbridge for the last time that autumn. The factory continued without him. The strikes had not killed Longbridge. That verdict, endlessly repeated, is too simple and too convenient for those who wish to locate the plant's difficulties in the behavior of its workforce rather than in the decisions of its managers, its owners, and its government. What the strikes had done was consume time, money, goodwill, and the patience of customers who had learned over a decade that a British Leyland car might or might not be delivered when promised. That erosion was real, and it had left Longbridge with very little margin for what was coming next. In the autumn of 1979, Michael Edwards stood before the Longbridge workforce and told them something that no British Leyland chairman had previously been willing to say in public. The company was close to the edge. The old ways were finished, and the choice before them was not between comfort and change, but between change and closure. It was not a speech designed to be popular. It was, in the event, more effective than anyone had anticipated. Partly because Edwards had the particular authority of a man who had already demonstrated, through the dismissal of Derek Robinson, that he meant what he said. What Edwards understood, and what his predecessors had consistently underestimated, was that Longbridge's problems were not primarily industrial, they were structural. The factory could build cars. It had always been able to build cars. What it could not do, within the financial and organizational framework it had inherited from a decade of nationalized drift, was build cars that enough people wanted to buy at a price that left any margin for investment in sufficient volume to justify the scale of the operation. The workforce's cooperation was necessary, but not sufficient. What Longbridge needed, in addition to industrial peace, was a product. In October 1980, it got one. The Austin Metro, launched with a marketing campaign of unusual ambition for a company still widely associated with industrial chaos, was the car that British Leyland had been attempting to build, in one form or another, since the mid-1970s. Its development had consumed years of wrangling, several redesigns, and a government investment of £140 million in the retooling of the Longbridge facilities. The new West Works, equipped with the most extensive robotic body shell assembly line yet installed in a British factory, represented a genuine modernization. The first serious attempt to bring Longbridge's manufacturing infrastructure into contact with the decade it was actually operating in. The Metro was not a great car, in the way the Mini had been a great car. It did not redefine anything, did not alter the terms on which the industry thought about itself. But it was a good car, honestly engineered, priced correctly, and launched into a market that was, by 1980, actively disposed to give British Leyland one more chance. It sold. In its first full year of production, the Metro was the best-selling car in Britain. For a company that had spent the better part of a decade generating headlines about strikes and losses and management crises, a bestseller was not merely a commercial event. It was a psychological one. Longbridge had not forgotten how to make something people wanted. But the Metro's success, real as it was, rested on a foundation that Edwards and his team understood to be insufficient for the long term. British Leyland's engineering capacity, its ability to develop genuinely new platforms, new engines, new technologies, had been so severely degraded by years of underinvestment and internal conflict that it could not, from its own resources, produce the range of competitive products the company needed to survive the decade. The Metro filled one gap. There were others, and filling them would require either money that the government was increasingly reluctant to provide or engineering expertise from somewhere else entirely. The somewhere else was Japan. The agreement between British Leyland and Honda Motor Company, first signed in 1979 and substantially deepened through the early 1980s, was one of the more improbable industrial partnerships of the era. A marriage of convenience between a demoralized British nationalized company and a Japanese manufacturer that had spent the previous 2 decades quietly becoming one of the most technically sophisticated car makers in the world. Honda wanted access to the European market and specifically to European manufacturing. British Leyland wanted engines, platforms, and the accumulated engineering discipline of a company that had not spent the 1970s on strike. Both parties got what they needed, at least for a time. The first tangible product of the partnership was the Triumph Acclaim of 1981, a Honda Ballade built under license at Longbridge's sister plant at Cowley. It was followed in 1984 by the first Rover 200 and in 1986 by the Rover 800. The latter co-developed with Honda's own legend and representing the most serious attempt yet by the company to compete in the executive car market that Jaguar had long monopolized. The cars were better than anything British Leyland had been able to produce independently. They were better built, better engineered, more consistently reliable. The Honda partnership had given Longbridge and its associated plants something they had not possessed since the early days of the Mini, a product range that did not require the customer to make allowances. The workforce responded. The number of working days lost to industrial disputes fell sharply through the early 1980s. partly as a consequence of Edwards' restructuring, partly as a consequence of a national recession that had made the cost of militancy more visible, and partly because people who are building cars they are not embarrassed by in general to find fewer reasons to stop building them. The atmosphere at Longbridge was not transformed. The institutional memories were too long and the structural tensions too deep for any transformation that rapid, but it was, measurably and genuinely, improved. In 1986, the renamed Rover Group, British Leyland, had shed the name along with several of its less viable operations, recorded its first operating profit in years. It was a modest figure, achieved in conditions that would not survive close examination, but it was real. The line was running, the cars were selling, the partnership with Honda was producing vehicles that the press reviewed without reflexive condescension. For one brief moment in the middle of the decade, it was possible to believe that Longbridge had found its way through. In 1988, British Aerospace acquired the Rover Group from the government for a price that subsequent parliamentary investigations would establish as substantially below the company's actual value, a transaction that the National Audit Office later described, with considerable restraint, as not providing value for money for the taxpayer. The sale was presented publicly as a liberation. Rover, freed from state ownership, would now compete on commercial terms, unburdened by political interference. What it actually represented was the beginning of the end of the Honda lifeline and the start of a different kind of dependency, with consequences that nobody at Longbridge, in the cautious optimism of 1988, was yet in a position to see. In January 1994, BMW's chairman Bernd Pischetsrieder flew to Longbridge and walked the factory floor with the unhurried confidence of a man who has already made his decision. The acquisition of the Rover Group from British Aerospace had been announced the previous month at a price of £800 million, a figure that struck many in the British press as either very generous or very foolish, depending on their assessment of what exactly BMW had bought. Pischetsrieder, whose great-uncle had designed the original Mini, was characteristically untroubled by the skepticism. Rover, he believed, had something that no amount of German engineering could manufacture from scratch. Heritage, the Land Rover name, the MG badge, a century of British automotive history that could be repositioned, with sufficient investment and patience, into a premium offering capable of sitting alongside BMW's own Marquez without embarrassment. The Longbridge workforce received the news with the cautious optimism that years of disappointment had taught them to ration carefully. BMW had money, BMW had discipline. BMW had, above all else, a demonstrable ability to build cars that people actually wanted, at prices that actually generated profit. After the financial ambiguities of the British Aerospace years and the increasingly strained partnership with Honda, the prospect of German rigor applied to Rover's problems had a certain appeal. For a time, the investment was real. BMW committed substantial capital to Rover's product development program. The Rover 75, launched in 1998, was the most accomplished car to carry the Rover name since the P6 of the late 1960s, a genuinely handsome saloon that demonstrated, conclusively, what the market could achieve when properly resourced. Land Rover's product range was refreshed. The MGF sports car, developed before the BMW acquisition but launched under it in 1995, found a loyal market and restored some luster to the oldest name in the Rover portfolio. But beneath the product launches and the press releases, the numbers were not working. Rover was losing money, not the modest, manageable losses of a company in transition, but the deep, structural losses of an operation whose cost base could not be reconciled with its revenues, regardless of how the accounting was arranged. BMW's own internal projections, which became public only years later through parliamentary investigations, showed that the company had understood by 1996 that Rover's recovery would require a level of investment and a length of time that its board was not prepared to commit to. The question from that point forward was not whether BMW would exit. It was when and on whose terms. The answer came in stages, each one more damaging than the last. In 1999, BMW made the decision that would seal Longbridge's fate. The new generation Mini, the car that Longbridge had every historical and sentimental reason to claim as its own, would be manufactured not at Longbridge but at the Cowley plant in Oxford. The reasoning was presented in logistical terms. Cowley had available floor space, the right infrastructure, the necessary proximity to the supply chain. The reasoning was not untrue, but it was also and primarily a judgment that Longbridge's cost structure, its labor relations legacy, and its aging site made it the wrong location for a vehicle on which BMW was staking a significant part of its future. Longbridge was handed the new Rover 25 and 45, competent but unexciting facelifts of existing models, and told, in effect, to manage on what it had. Without the Mini, Longbridge had no product with a future. Everyone in the factory understood this. Most of them did not say it aloud, because saying it aloud would have required confronting a conclusion that nobody in Birmingham in 1999 was ready to reach. In May 2000, BMW formally severed its connection with Rover. The Land Rover operation was sold to Ford for approximately £2 billion. The Rover car business, Longbridge, its workforce, its debts, and its uncertain future, was sold to a consortium of 4 Birmingham businessmen for a purchase price of £10. £10. The Phoenix Consortium, John Towers, Peter Beale, Nick Stevenson, and John Edwards, presented themselves as saviors. They were, in the language of the moment, white knights, local men who understood the West Midlands, who believed in British manufacturing, who were prepared to do what the Germans had ultimately declined to do and commit to Longbridge for the long term. They were received in Birmingham and in the national press with a warmth that the subsequent evidence suggests they did not deserve. BMW, alongside the £10 purchase price, provided £500 million in financial support, loans, debt forgiveness, and working capital intended to give the new company sufficient runway to restructure, develop new models, and return to profitability. It was, in the circumstances, a remarkable act of industrial generosity, motivated at least partly by the political embarrassment of abandoning 25,000 West Midlands jobs without providing the means of replacement. What the Phoenix Ford did with that £500 million became, in time, one of the more comprehensively examined questions in the history of British corporate governance. Parliamentary investigations and independent audits established that, in the years between 2000 and 2005, the 4 principals of the Phoenix Consortium received combined remuneration, salaries, pension contributions, and financial arrangements of various kinds, totaling in the region of £42 million. The cars they were supposed to be developing were not developed. The new models that Longbridge needed to compete against an increasingly aggressive European and Asian market did not arrive. The money that should have been invested in the factory's future made its way, through channels that required considerable investigative patience to trace, into the personal financial arrangements of 4 men who had bought a car company for £10. By 2004, MG Rover was losing £77 million annually. The workforce had fallen from the 12,000 employed at the time of the Phoenix acquisition to 6,500. Negotiations with the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, a potential Chinese partner that might, in different circumstances, have provided the capital injection the company needed, collapsed in the early months of 2005, leaving MG Rover without a product strategy, without a financial partner, and without the resources to continue trading for more than a matter of weeks. The £10 had bought exactly what it had cost. The morning of Friday, the 8th of April 2005, began at Longbridge the way 20,000 mornings before it had begun, with the sound of feet on tarmac and the particular low groan of the assembly line warming to its first cycle of the day. Along Longbridge Lane and down the Bristol Road, the early shift arrived in the manner of people for whom a place has become inseparable from identity. Men in their 50s who had never worked anywhere else. Younger men who had followed fathers and grandfathers through the same gate, been handed the same union card, learned the particular rhythms of the same damp, enormous, complicated factory that smelled of machine oil and floor paint and the accumulated industry of 100 years. They arrived on foot and by bicycle in Rover 25s bought at staff discount and Metro vans that had outlasted their manufacturers. The gates were open, the clocks were running, the line, as always, was waiting. Thomas Higgins, not his real name, but his story, was 41 years old that morning. a body shop inspector on the final quality check of the Rover 75 line. His grandfather had started at Longbridge in 1947, working the press shop in the years when the factory still had the particular institutional confidence of a place that had helped win a war. His father had joined in 1971, spending 32 years on various sections of the assembly operation before retiring, with his pension and his memories, in 2003. Thomas himself had come through the gates for the first time in 1987, 18 years old and carrying the particular mixture of pride and obligation that attaches itself to a man joining something that his family has already decided, on his behalf, is where he belongs. 18 years. He had learned every mood the factory had. He had worked through the anxieties of the British aerospace years and the cautious optimism of the early BMW period. He had watched the Mini leave for Cali in 1999 with the hollow feeling of a man who has been told, without being told directly, that the thing he does for a living is not the thing that matters most. He had wanted to believe in Phoenix. Most of them had wanted to believe in Phoenix. By the morning of the 8th of April, 2005, he had stopped believing. The rumors had been circulating since the previous weekend. The SAC talks had failed. That much was known or suspected, or had been confirmed to someone who had told someone else, in the way that essential information always moves through a factory before it appears on any official notice board. The administrators from PricewaterhouseCoopers had been seen entering the main offices on Thursday evening. Their presence was not ambiguous. Administrators do not attend meetings about recovery plans. And yet the shift began. The line ran. Thomas took his position at the final inspection point, where the finished Rover 75s, burgundy, silver, the occasional racing green that still moved something in him, despite everything, came to rest for their pre-delivery examination. He checked the shut lines of the doors, the alignment of the bonnet, the fit of the interior trim. He had done this, or versions of this, for 18 years. His hands knew the work independently of any conscious instruction. At 11 o'clock, the senior managers were summoned to the boardroom. At 11:30, their deputies were called. By noon, the information had moved, by the usual invisible channels, from the offices to the floor, not through the tannoy, not through any official communication, through the look on a supervisor's face, through the particular quality of silence that falls over a large space when the people in it are all thinking the same thing. At 12:15, MG Rover Group Limited entered administration. PricewaterhouseCoopers assumed control of the company's operations. The line did not stop immediately. There were cars in various stages of completion on every section, and the practical logic of manufacturing does not yield instantly to financial catastrophe. A body shell half-welded cannot simply be left half-welded. A door not yet hung cannot be unhung. The line ran on for another 40 minutes, completing what it had started, before the section managers began, one by one, to call their teams together. Thomas was told by his section manager, a man he had worked beside for 11 years, in a corridor beside the fire door that led to the car park. The words used were precise and careful and entirely inadequate to the occasion. The company has gone into administration. Production is suspended with immediate effect. You will be contacted regarding your employment status. The section manager looked at the floor when he said it. Thomas noticed this. The looking at the floor and understood it as the gesture of a man who felt the weight of what he was delivering and could not find any other way to carry it. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the factory floor had the quality of a place between states, neither working nor not working, neither ordinary nor yet fully aware of what it had become. Groups of men stood in the sections where, an hour earlier, they had been building cars. Some of them were on their phones, calling wives, calling parents, trying to assemble, from the fragments of official information available, some picture of what the next week would look like. Others stood in silence. Not the comfortable silence of men who know each other well enough not to need words, but the silence of people absorbing a fact too large to speak around. The shop stewards gathered in the car park outside the West Works, where the wind off the Bristol Road carried the particular chill of a British April that has not yet decided to become spring. There were no speeches. The instinct for oratory that had animated so many Longbridge gatherings, the platforms and the megaphones, and the solidarity that once could turn a shift change into something resembling a political meeting, had on this afternoon deserted them entirely. What the stewards discussed, in practical voices, were practical questions. When would the wages for the current week be paid? What did administration mean for the pension fund? Was there a redundancy entitlement? And if so, what was it, and when would it arrive? These were the right questions. They were also, in their very practicality, the measure of how completely the situation had moved beyond the register of industrial relations into something more personal and more final. Nobody was asking about the return to work. Nobody was asking about the next model or the next negotiation or what management's position would be when the dispute was eventually resolved. There was no dispute. There was no negotiation. There was only the fact of 6,500 people in the middle of a Friday afternoon without jobs. 6,500. The number moved through the factory in the way that significant numbers do. Repeated, confirmed, questioned, repeated again. It was the total directly employed at Longbridge at the time of the administration. It did not include the thousands more employed in the supply chain, the component manufacturers, the logistics operations, the ancillary businesses whose existence had been organized around the assumption that Longbridge would continue to require their services. The true figure of those whose working lives were disrupted by what happened on the 8th of April 2005 was substantially larger than 6,500. But 6,500 was the number that people could hold in their heads, and it was large enough. Thomas finished his shift, or what remained of it, at his inspection station, completing the paperwork on the last Rover 75 that had passed through his hands. The car was finished. It would never be sold. The administration process would eventually dispose of the cars in various ways that had nothing to do with the intentions of the people who had built them. But it was finished. Thomas initialed the inspection sheet with the care he had brought to 18 years of inspection sheets because it was the last one, and the last one deserved the same attention as all the others. At 5 o'clock, he walked out through the gate he had walked through every working day since 1987. The gate was still open. It would remain open through the administration process, in access controlled by the administrators rather than by the company that no longer existed. He stood for a moment in the car park in the April afternoon beside the Rover 25 he had bought at the staff discount in 2003. The car was 2 years old. It was, he had always thought, a decent car. Not exceptional. Not the kind of thing that people wrote about in enthusiast magazines, but solid and honest and well-made. The product of people who knew their trade and had applied it with care. He did not start the engine immediately. He sat in the driver's seat and looked back at the gate and at the factory behind it, the roof lines of the West Works, the overhead walkway that crossed the Bristol Road, the particular industrial skyline that had been the fixed point of his working life. The line inside was cold now. The Rover 75 he had signed off an hour earlier would be the last car he inspected at Longbridge. His father had known this day was coming. His grandfather had not lived to see it. 3 generations. 1 gate, 1 factory, 1 century. Behind him, in the car park, the other men of the early shift were getting into their cars. Engines starting, indicators clicking. The small, ordinary sounds of people going home at the end of a working day, except that this was the last working day. And home from this point forward would be somewhere they returned to without the fixed point that had organized the rest of it. The gate closed at 6:17 that evening. A security guard the administrator's firm had sent from Birmingham city center fitted a new padlock to the chain. He had not, as far as anyone knew, ever been inside the factory. He locked it with the efficient indifference of a man performing a routine task, climbed back into his van, and drove away down the Bristol Road. Inside, the line was cold. The lights were off in the assembly halls. The Rover 75 that Thomas Higgins had signed off at 4:15 sat in the delivery bay where it had been placed, finished and documented and going nowhere. 100 years of noise in the space of one afternoon had become silence. On the morning of Saturday, the 9th of April 2005, the gates of Longbridge were still there. The new padlock was still on the chain. The security guard's van was gone. Along the Bristol Road, the traffic moved as it always had. Buses, lorries, the ordinary flow of a Birmingham weekend morning. Past a factory that, for the first time in 100 years, had nothing moving inside it. The silence lasted longer than most people expected, and less long than the place deserved. Within days of the administration, the practical machinery of industrial dissolution had begun its work. PricewaterhouseCoopers moved through the site with the systematic efficiency of people who have performed this function before and understand that sentiment, however legitimate, is not a category that appears in an administrator's report. Assets were cataloged. Liabilities were assessed. The question of what Longbridge was worth, now that it was no longer a going concern, was approached with the clinical detachment that the situation legally required, and the workforce, watching from outside the new padlock, found almost physically painful to observe. The cars in the delivery bays were disposed of first, sold at reduced prices through dealers, or transferred to the administrator's own disposal arrangements. The partially completed vehicles on the line were assessed and mostly scrapped. The tooling, the equipment, the accumulated physical infrastructure of a century of car manufacturing was inventoried, valued, and in many cases sold to manufacturers in other countries who had no sentimental attachment to its origins and simply needed machines that worked. The overhead conveyor bridge, the enclosed walkway that carried body shells across the Bristol Road from the Westworks to the car assembly buildings on the south side, came down in the early months of 2006. It had been one of the most distinctive features of the Longbridge skyline, a structure so familiar to the residents of South Birmingham that its absence registered as a kind of physical shock, the way the removal of a landmark always does. Not with drama, but with the quiet wrongness of a space that has forgotten what used to fill it. The demolition crew took it down in sections, methodically over the course of a fortnight. The Bristol Road ran beneath it, unimpeded for the first time since the structure had been erected. It was the beginning of a dismantling that would take a decade. The developer, St. Modwen Properties, acquired the majority of the Longbridge site and began in 2005 the process of converting what had been the largest car factory in Britain into something that the planning documents described as a mixed-use regeneration scheme. The language of regeneration is always optimistic. It has to be, because it is the language of replacement, and replacement requires the prior acceptance of loss. At Longbridge, the loss was not abstract. The press shop where Thomas Higgins' grandfather had worked the overnight shift in 1951 became, in time, a retail park. The car assembly buildings where the Mini had been made at the rate of one every 2 minutes became, eventually, the foundations for a Marks & Spencer, a KFC, a Premier Inn, a Costa Coffee. The new buildings were clean and functional and entirely without memory. No plaque was erected. No permanent marker was placed to record what had happened on this ground, or for how long, or by how many people. The regeneration proceeded on the assumption that what the area needed was a future, and that the past, being irrecoverable, was best left to take care of itself. It did not entirely take care of itself. In August 2008, 3 years after the padlock went on the chain, a ceremony was held in what remained of the Longbridge factory, a small portion of the site that had not yet been cleared, retained by the Nanjing Automobile Corporation, which had purchased the MG brand and certain assets from the administrators. At this ceremony, with Chinese executives and local politicians in attendance, a production line was restarted. The car being produced was the MG-TF, a sports car that had last been made at Longbridge before the administration, now being assembled from components manufactured in China and finished in Birmingham. The workforce numbered in the hundreds. The atmosphere, by the accounts of those present, combined genuine goodwill with a persistent undertow of unreality, the sense of a gesture being made toward a thing that had already ended, rather than the beginning of something new. The MGTF production continued in modest volumes for several years. It was not nothing. The people who worked on it were doing real work, building real cars, earning real wages. But it was not Longbridge in any sense that the people who had clocked in through the main gate before April 2005 would have recognized. It was a remnant, a fragment of the original operation kept alive by Chinese investment and British sentiment, occupying a corner of a site that was being demolished around it. In late 2010, Nanjing's parent company, the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, the same ZAIC whose failed negotiations with MG Rover had contributed to the administration of 2005, absorbed the Nanjing operation and assumed control of the MG brand. Production at Longbridge continued intermittently and in small numbers under the new ownership. New models were announced. Investment was promised. The site retained for a few more years the form of a manufacturing operation without quite the substance of one. On the 23rd of September 2016, SAIC's MG Motor announced that all vehicle assembly at Longbridge had ceased. The remaining production was being transferred to China, where labor costs, supply chain logistics, and manufacturing scale made the economics of car production more straightforward than they could ever be in a small retained corner of a South Birmingham regeneration project. The announcement was made without ceremony. There was, by 2016, no workforce large enough to gather, no union convener to make a statement, no political significance sufficient to attract a minister. The last car left the last remaining line, and the line was switched off, and that was the end. Two-thirds of the original Longbridge site had by this point been cleared and rebuilt. Where the West Works had stood, the vast machine shop that the government had funded in 1916, the building where 1,000 machines had run simultaneously through 2 world wars and 50 years of peacetime production, there was now a supermarket car park. The Longbridge railway station that had served the factory's workers for 90 years had been closed and rebuilt as a new halt serving the regenerated town center. Its original platforms removed, its original purpose rendered obsolete. Austin Village survived. The 200 wooden houses that Herbert Austin had imported from Michigan in 1917, built to shelter the workers he could not otherwise house, still stood around Central Avenue in the residential streets north of the old factory boundary. Some had been modified almost beyond recognition. Others retained in their proportions and their timber framing the ghost of what they had been, the visible evidence of a paternalism that, whatever its limitations, had at least understood that the people who built the cars needed somewhere to live. The factory that had employed them was almost entirely gone. The houses remained. It was, in its way, the most honest monument Longbridge had. In April 2025, the Longbridge plant employed 46 people. They worked in a building that had once been part of a factory complex covering 300 acres, on a site that had once supported 27,000 workers, in a city whose industrial identity had been shaped, more than by any other single institution, by the enterprise that Herbert Austin had begun here, with 7,500 pounds and 2 weeks of furious improvisation in the autumn of 1905. The 46 were employed by MG Motor, a brand owned by the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, headquartered in China, manufacturing its vehicles in China. And their function was not to build cars, but to inspect them. Each MG arriving at Longbridge from the production lines of Shanghai was checked, assessed, and certified before being released into the European market. The work was real and the people doing it were skilled, but it was not in any sense that the previous century would have recognized car manufacturing. The MG Motor Technical Center, the name on the new signage above the gate, occupied a modest footprint on the eastern edge of what had been the Longbridge site. Around it, the regeneration that St. Modwin had been prosecuting for 2 decades had reshaped the landscape so thoroughly that a worker returning from a 30-year absence would have struggled to locate the landmarks by which he had previously navigated his working day. The press shop was gone. The body assembly halls were gone. The overhead conveyor bridge was gone. Its crossing point over the Bristol Road, now unmarked by anything except the flow of traffic that had been moving beneath it, unaware of its significance, for 20 years. The car assembly building, where the last Rover 75 had been signed off on the afternoon of the 8th of April 2005, had been demolished and replaced by retail units whose tenants had no knowledge of what had previously occupied the ground beneath their stockrooms. The 46 worked in the quiet that follows a century of noise. They clocked in through a gate that bore a logo, the MG Octagon, one of the most recognizable symbols in British automotive history, that now signified something quite different from what it had signified when it was first attached to a sports car produced by workers in Abingdon in the 1920s. The Octagon had survived everything: the mergers and the nationalizations, the strikes and the restructurings, the German acquisition and the Chinese one. It had proved more durable than the companies that had carried it, more persistent than the factories that had made the cars it adorned. It was still there, above the gate in April 2025. What it meant was another question. Austin Village was still there too. Along Central Avenue and the residential streets that radiate from it, the wooden houses that Herbert Austin had imported from Michigan in 1917, built to shelter the workers he needed and the city could not yet house, stood in the particular condition of structures that have outlived their original purpose, but found through a combination of affection and inertia a reason to persist. Some had been extended, clad in brick or render, their timber origins visible only to those who knew what to look for. Others retained the proportions and the detail of what they had been, modest, practical, human-scaled, the architecture of a man who understood that a factory and its workers were a single system and that the system needed feeding, sheltering, sustaining. The factory that Austin had built to go with the houses was almost entirely gone. The houses were still standing. There is a question that everyone who thinks seriously about Longbridge eventually arrives at, and it is this: could it have been saved? The question has many answers, and all of them are partial. BMW, it is argued, could have built the new Mini at Longbridge rather than Cowley in 1999. A decision that might have given the site a product with a future and spared it the slow diminishment that followed. The Phoenix 4 could have invested the £500 million that BMW provided into product development rather than into their own financial arrangements. A decision so elementary that its absence remains, 20 years on, a source of genuine public anger. The government could have intervened earlier, or more decisively, or differently, could have attached conditions to the Phoenix sale that might have made the asset stripping that followed more difficult or impossible. The workforce and the union leadership could, at various points across 3 decades, have made different calculations about what was worth striking for and what was not. The management of British Leyland could, across the same period, have made different decisions about investment, about product, about the internal competition between plants that should have been cooperating. Each of these counterfactuals is, in isolation, plausible. None of them, individually, is sufficient. Longbridge was not killed by a single decision or a single decade or a single class of people who made the wrong choices while everyone else made the right ones. It was killed by the accumulated weight of decisions made across 60 years by managers and workers and politicians and financiers who were all, in their different ways, optimizing for something other than the long-term survival of a car factory in South Birmingham. The optimizations were sometimes venal, sometimes mistaken, sometimes simply the rational response to an incentive structure that pointed in the wrong direction. The effect was the same. And yet, when this is the thing that resists the tidiness of any verdict, Longbridge made things that mattered. The Austin 7 put a generation of British families in their first motor car. The Mini redrew the boundaries of what automotive engineering could achieve in a small space. The Rover 75 demonstrated, as late as 1998, that the accumulated craft knowledge of a century of Birmingham manufacturing had not been extinguished by everything that had been done to extinguish it. The Hurricane fighters built in the Underground Aero during the winter of 1940 flew from airfields in Kent and Sussex and helped determine the outcome of a battle on which, it is not an exaggeration to say, the course of the war depended. These things happened here. They were made by people who lived in the wooden houses on Central Avenue and the terraced streets of Northfield and Longbridge and Rubery, people whose names are not on any plaque, whose contributions are not commemorated by any permanent marker on the retail park that occupies the ground where they worked. In April 2025, 46 people clocked in through the gate beneath the MG Octagon and began their working day. They checked cars built in Shanghai and certified them for the European market. The work was quiet and methodical. Outside, the Bristol Road carried its usual traffic past the new buildings and the supermarket car parks and the occasional stretch of old boundary wall that the demolition crews had, for reasons of cost or oversight, left standing. The gates were still there. The sign was still there. The question of what was lost here and whether it had to be and who decided, that question was still there too. It has not been answered. It may not be answerable, but it is the kind of question that a place earns the right to ask only by having been, for a very long time, something that mattered, Longbridge was that. Whatever it is now, it was that.